When you talk about your carbon footprint for net zero, you have to consider business travel. It is significant, and for some companies, very significant. Okay, you have to consider trains, planes, automobiles, taxis, tube, the whole 9 yards. Let's split that into sections and have a look at how we do each of those components step by step, piece by piece. Okay, let's go. It's bonkers hot here in Oxford, so I hope you don't mind, but I've come outside to film this video because it's just too hot inside. And to make it more pleasant, I've got a nice glass, nice glass of Santa Steph. That's really quite nice. So I'll be downing that as we go through the video. So first off, let's have a look at one component which you have to consider for net zero, which is staff mileage. Okay, now staff mileage is the mileage that the staff do, your employees do on your behalf. It's normally claimed back as a business expense. You know, here in the UK, that's typically 45 pence a mile, and typically every month someone puts an expenses claim and says, look, I did so many miles, and this is therefore how much I'm claiming back. And that rate is set by the government, generally, not always, but generally. Okay, so most of the companies I deal with can produce some form of spreadsheet showing who did what miles, and that's what we're talking about here. We're not talking about company vehicles. They were covered generally in scope 1, diesel, petrol, these days hybrid and electric as well. But we're talking about someone going on a business trip, or having to visit a customer. They use their own card, they put the expense claim in. To process the emissions through, you're going to need to know a couple of things. Okay, you're going to need to know what size of engine that car has. Yeah, so, and that's generally simplified to small, medium, or large. 1.2 litres, 1.8 litres, and then so less than 1.2 in the middle or over. And with those, there is a problem in that typically when people put in expense claims, they don't know that information. I'll come on to that in a second. But the first thing you need to know is small, medium, or large engine. The second piece of information is what engine type is it? Petrol, diesel, hybrid, electric? What's it going to be? Okay, and there's sort of a matrix. And if you need more information, the matrix is given in my book, Net Zero for Business. Very practical guide on how to get your business to net zero. And in the Anistic software and in the Yeti software, it's all just pre-programmed in. So it sounds harder than it is, but, and here's the but, normally when people put in expense claims, they don't tell you the information about their engine size and the engine type, so they don't know that. If that's the case with you, two things. First, have a think about starting to ask that information. It's not complex, just tick a box, as you put in the expense claim in, either on paper or with the electronic expenses system you run. Or secondly, if that is either something you haven't done yet or something you think actually it's too complex, make the assumption that they're all medium-sized engine of diesel. Okay, so medium diesel. And that's what a lot of companies, including us, do if we don't know that information. Okay, because you don't want to hold yourself back and say, well, I can't work it out. Yeah, you can just make that assumption and make a note in the report saying, look, we recommend that this area is improved on in future, but that's the assumption we're making. Okay. A last gotcha when we talk about staff mileage, just be a bit careful about electric cars, okay? Because if the staff charge their own vehicles on a company premises, you will have already counted that electricity in your carbon footprint in your scope 2, okay? So if you then put it through again, you'll be double counting. So just be a little bit careful of that. But apart from that, that's staff mileage. You need to know engine size, engine type, distance, and that will allow you to work it through it and get the fact you need. Okay, now let's have a look at the next one. So as the Santa Steph is going down, well, let's have a look at flights, okay? Because flights can be a little bit more complicated, and they certainly sort of cause a few people to just sort of pause, but it's really quite straightforward. What you do for your flights is you split them into two basic sort of camps, or two basic divisions of information. What routes your staff take, okay, and then second, how frequently those routes are travelled. So what you do is you work out the carbon emissions for each of the routes, and then just multiply it by the number of times that route was travelled. Okay, so you might say, for example, Heathrow to JFK return, business class, and that is route 1. And route 1, that route was travelled, for example, 27 times in January, something like that. Okay, so when you talk about routes, to work out the carbon emission of each route, you need a few bits of information. The first thing is, what's the origin and what's the destination? In that previous example, Heathrow to JFK. Okay, that's one. From that, you can work out the distance, and that, for the geeks among us, that's called the Great Circle distance, I think, something like that. Yeah, and you can work out the distance between them. Second, you need to know whether it's a domestic, short haul, long haul, or international flight. Okay, domestic is obviously one that takes off and lands in the same country. Short haul is it takes off and lands, I think something like 3,000 miles is the cutoff, but it does vary. And generally, if you're in the UK, you're talking about, you know, European travel, and it's pretty obvious sometimes when you know whether it's short or long haul. The third bit of information you need is what class of travel it is. So, you know, you might say, well, this is business class, or this is premium economy, or first class, if you're lucky to do first class. And then the last bit is it single or return? Okay. Once you know those pieces of information, you can either sit down and work out what the Great Circle distance is and multiply it with the right factors, or better still, you know, you can put it into the software and the software will calculate the carbon emissions of that flight for you. Okay, it's pretty straightforward. And just as a little fun fact, when I wrote that section of the book, I was actually traveling in an A380 at the time, and I did a quick Google when I sort of landed about an A380, and I found out it can take 320,000 litres of fuel. It's quite a lot, really. There's 320,000 litres, and it burns fuel at 4 litres per second. Quite a lot. Okay, so that's how you do flights. You look at defining routes and then multiply it by the number of times the route was covered. Okay, hope that was useful. I'm going to have a sip of the Bordeaux. Thank you. Let's have a look at hotels. The way you work out the carbon emissions from the hotel stays, which you must include for net zero, okay, is that you look at where the hotel was and how many guest nights were spent in that hotel. So you might say, for example, it's a hotel in London, and hotel stays in London, we did, for example, 305 of them in January, 207 of them in February, etc. And then the software will sort of tell you what the emissions are per guest per night, and just multiply the two together, and that's the hotel number. I think it's an area that is one that will be improved with further research in the area, because it's pretty crude at the moment. All you say is, if you're in this country, the emissions per night are this. It makes no distinction whether you stay in a small B&B or in a luxury 5-star. It makes no distinction at all. So I think it will get more sophisticated as time goes on, but right now that's exactly how you do it. How many nights, where was it, multiply the two together, and the software does the hard work for you, okay? And Mystic, Yeti, whatever it is you'll be using. I thought I'd just chuck in a couple of examples for you. UK generally is 13.9 kilograms of CO2 equivalent, so 13.9 kg CO2e per guest per night, okay? I had a look down at what the worst one was and see if you can figure out what the worst one was. I don't know what you guys would think. It was the Maldives. So the Maldives were at 183 kilograms CO2e per guest per night. So it's a huge one, it's over 10 times worse, okay? And for some reason, London, just apropos nothing, is 13.8. So it's 0.1 kilograms better to stay in London for some reason. No idea why. Maybe there's something to do with proximity and supply chains and things like that. I don't know. So that's how you look at hotels. Right, now back to the Santa Steph, and then let's have a look at trains, taxis, and stuff like that. Okay, trains, taxis, tubes, trams. How do we process those? Again, it's very straightforward, and the software will do most of the work for you. But if not, in the book, I think probably around about page 170, I think, there's tables and charts in there that you can look up and give you figures of carbon emissions per passenger mile or per passenger kilometre. And what that means is that if you travel, for example, 27 miles on the train, 27 times, and then you look up the carbon factor either in the book, or you can sort of let the software do it for you. And that will then give you the emissions of that journey, be it rail or if it's 27 miles in a taxi, whatever that's going to be, etc. So the factors are in there. It's a very straightforward calculation. I would say there's a couple of things that sort of I'd bring to your attention. The first is that, you know, the train calculation is particularly difficult. There aren't any hard and fast figures in there on, you know, what are the carbon emissions of a rail journey. There are some, but you know, I found about 4 or 5 different sources, and they're all really very different. So I'm not sure yet that we've got that entirely nailed down. So that's likely to change as more research goes into this area. And the second is, don't get hung up about the smaller journeys. If you've got, for example, you know 412 flights, and for some reason you've got one taxi journey, don't beat yourself up about the taxi journey. Sometimes these all the different travel mechanisms that you could consider, they're so small that you might just say, look, I tell you what, we know we didn't consider it, but we don't consider it material. We are not going to calculate it. We're not going to include it, okay? And if that is less than 5–10%, I don't think anyone would really mind, okay? So don't beat yourself up trying to do it exhaustively. Just look at the biggest ones you do, train, taxi, tube, tram, whatever it's going to be, just do those, and feel free to just put the other ones to one side with a footnote in the report, okay? Let's have a look at the last one now, which is all about commuting and work from home. Commuting and work from home. You have to consider them. Please don't ignore them. They are more significant than most people think, okay? We did a piece of work for a client that's got about 1,700 staff, and we did a calculation for them in something like 2018, 2019, before COVID. Then COVID hit, and we repeated the calculation. At this stage, everyone is working remotely. And what we expected to see is the commuting factor, you know, was significant, and it would drop down to 0, you know, and so they'd save a huge amount of carbon, or they would look as if they were saving a huge amount of carbon. But do you know what? By the time you take the work from home factor in, so when people work from home, typically they have to heat the place, okay? And that heating is non-trivial. In a big office block, you can put in a very large, efficient boiler or air conditioner or some other kind of heat pump in there to heat a large space in a very efficient way. Generally, domestic heating systems are far worse. And you know what we saw when we did the calculations is that yes, the commuting figures went down pretty much to 0, but that work from home was roughly 60 or 70% of what their original commuting number was, okay? So it is significant. You should not really ignore it. The actual calculation itself is pretty straightforward. So if you want to do it manually, split everybody's commute, you know, all the staff that you wish to consider. Write down the different legs of the journey. That, for example, I took a bike to the rail station, I then took the train, I then took the tube into the office, etc. And each leg of the journey, use the kind of factors I was talking about earlier in the video to work out the carbon emissions of each one of those legs of the journey, then add them up, and that's the figure for commuting for that person. However, there is a much easier way of doing it, which is if you can publish a form online, like a survey, either using software, you know, Mystic and Yeti have both got this built in to them, but you can either sort of point people to the survey, or you can use something like MailChimp or something to fire a survey out, collect the information into a spreadsheet. It's about 1,000,000 times easier, yeah, and you can process it from there. And of course, if you're using a software package, it goes straight into the calculation, so it's much easier, significantly easier. In that survey as well, you might want to ask how often they work from home, you know, either that week, that month, or in the previous 12 months, whatever it's going to be. But ask them, how frequently do you work from home? You know, what's the total number of days, etc. You can use that to then work out the work from home emissions. As I said, they are more significant than we were expecting, certainly. I don't know what your expectations are, but we thought they'd be a lot lower. But they are significant, they should be considered. And you can use the survey to figure out the work from home factors, okay? So that's how you do commuting, that's how you do work from home. The gotcha, there's typically a gotcha with these kind of business travel things, isn't there? But the gotcha is at the end is the work from home factors are pretty crude, all right? So when we did all the calculations, we had people saying to us, why have I got a work from home factor? And we said, well, you have to heat your space that you're working in, especially in winter, and there'll be power for the electrical devices that you use. And the pushback we had from a number of people is, well, actually, I work in a communal space. It's either, typically we had it frequently, my wife is working from home as well, therefore we don't need to heat it. Yeah. And at the moment, there aren't factors for that. So it just says work from home is such and such kilogram CO2e, either per day or per hour of working from home. And it doesn't draw any distinctions between, it doesn't make that more sophisticated anyway, and it is rather crude, but that's what we've got today. It's certainly better than nothing, but I think that area will get better as time ticks on. All right. So I hope that was useful for you. And maybe now it's time to have a quick summary and just say, well, what have we covered? So business travel, A, is significant. B, you must include it. If you didn't include it, it wouldn't really be a real carbon footprint. It wouldn't be a really real net zero calculation. In there, you must consider things like staff mileage. Okay, again, pretty straightforward to work out if you've got the data. Then you work out flights, then trains, taxis, tube, tram, etc. Again, rather straightforward if you've got the data. Difficult if you haven't. Then you do the commuting and the work from home. Best way to go about that is a survey, and collect the results in, process those, put it straight into the calculations. I think the whole business travel sector, in terms of carbon footprint, there are lots of things in there that need to be improved. They will get improved. So expect some changes in the area. It's bound to happen as people do more and more research into this. But that's the basics. I hope that was useful, and rather nice drop of Bordeaux. I'll carry on drinking this. See you next time.